get you to sleep. So you can learn it. She found a good piece of charm. It's good enough. Oh, one right there. All right. So continuing philosophy. Last time we finished up Socrates. Let's really quick reset up the scene of what's going on in philosophy. So we had first the Sophists, and the Sophists, they were skeptics, said nothing could be known. And Socrates was largely in opposition to the skeptics. Socrates was arguing for objective and absolute truth, beauty, and goodness. The good, the true, and the beautiful, they're all objective and absolute. So he is completely opposed to these skeptics. And he's looking around at the society around him, and he's wondering, why is it that everyone is collapsing into skepticism? He wanted to know what was going on here. He's opposed to it largely on ethical grounds, because people are able to intellectualize their depravity that he's seeing in his time in terms of the skeptics' philosophy. The skeptics say, what's good to you isn't necessarily good to me. Whatever appears good to you now is good for you now. That was the skeptic's position. And so this is leading to a depravity in his day. He had a large focus on ethics. He thinks, no, you ought to be dedicated to temperance, justice, courage, wisdom. These are the things that you ought to pursue. So why is our society collapsing into the skepticism and leading to this type of ethical behavior? He was mostly focused on the ethics. And so he came to the conclusion that the reason that all these skeptics are saying that there's no objective or absolute justice is because they're confused about the definition of justice. They have no coherent definition of justice in their mind to begin with. They don't really know what it is they're talking about when they're trying to talk about justice. And that's why they think that there's no objective and absolute justice. And so that's what he would go around doing. You claim that you have a definition for some term, typically ethical terms. He was mostly focused on ethics. But he pointed out the need for definitions in general. So for any ethical term you claim that you have some definition for in the Socratic dialogues, Socrates would come along and point out how whatever you thought your definition was doesn't really quite work. You come and you say courage is this, and you say, well, if that's courage, then doesn't that mean that this is also courageous? They say, yeah. Doesn't that mean this is also courageous? They say, yeah. Doesn't that mean this is also courageous? Yeah, but unfortunately that contradicts where we started. So that does away with your whole notion of courage. So what actually is courage? We're back to where we started. And so that's how these dialogues would go, these Socratic dialogues would go over and over again. So Socrates is establishing the need for definitions. Now, definitions apply to universals. We have a definition for cat, we don't have a definition for sprinkles, right? So definitions apply to universals. If we can get these definitions, then we can have understanding of universals and thereby have universal knowledge. And thereby show that truth, beauty, and goodness are in fact universal. So just because Socrates thought that you didn't have a definition doesn't mean he thought that no definition existed. He is not a skeptic. He believes in objective and absolute truth, good, and beauty. He just thought people didn't know. The skeptics say, you don't know and you can't know. Nobody knows. So he's completely opposed to the skeptics. And so then we get his most famous student, Plato. Plato is the one right here on the left, is Plato. Plato here, the student of Socrates, he's going to follow Socrates now. He's going to take for granted that there's objective and absolute truth, good, and beauty, and he's going to accept Plato's ethics, or he's going to accept Socrates' ethics, and he's going to say, yep, we ought to spend our lives in pursuit of temperance, courage, justice, wisdom. Those are good virtues. And what he's going to do is construct an entire system of philosophy now to vindicate Socrates' position. So he's now going to construct a metaphysics, an epistemology, an ethics, a politics, and aesthetics, all of which are coherent with each other, all of which have at their foundation the good, the true, and the beautiful. And he's going to make sure that the ethics is compatible with the type of ethics Socrates was teaching. So he's going to take what Socrates started with and then create a whole system of philosophy to support what it is Socrates passed on to him. And it's going to be the first complete system of philosophy that we get. So, Plato, the one right here on the left, over here, or on the right, over here on the left we have Aristotle. These are the two most influential philosophers of all time. This picture comes from a famous painting called The School of Athens by Raphael. It's just a close-up of that right there. That's where it comes from. And so these are supposed to be a bunch of the great Greek thinkers throughout time. I think that one's supposed to be Pythagoras. I think Euclid is over here drawing a figure. I think that was supposed to be Heraclitus. Socrates is one of these ones. I think he might be the one in the green. at the center of the picture, Plato and Aristotle, the two greatest philosophers of all time. We're now in what we call the golden age of philosophy. It starts with Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. We call it the golden age of philosophy. And you'll notice if we look up closely at these two, Plato and Aristotle, it looks like they're having a little bit of an argument. And we see Plato, he's standing right there and he's pointing one finger up. He's going to talk to us about how what's real, what the real is that one universal up there in the world of forms. And we're going to get to his world of forms. Aristotle's over here saying, no, it's this stuff right here around us. This is what's real, that's what matters. You're going to notice that he's holding a book called the Timaeus. We'll have a lot to say about that. That's where Plato explains his whole system of how the world of forms creates this world and causes us to experience this world. Aristotle here is holding his Nicomachean Ethics, which is a common sense notion for how you ought to live your life here and now. This has a lot to say about how things were there and then. This says a lot about how you ought to behave here and now. So, as we go through this, we're going to show a dichotomy between these two. Understand, relative to philosophy, Plato and Aristotle are right smack next to each other. Compared to Heraclitus, they're like this. Compared to the atomists, they're like this. As we portray them, we're going to separate them as much as we can and act like there's a huge difference between these two. But they both hold objective and absolute good, truth, and beauty right there at the foundation of their thought. And they're just going to build completely different systems to get that. So, focusing firstly on Plato. Plato, we've already touched on him. We'll skip over this 7th letter, but we'll recap a bunch of what we went over last time. So, greatest pupil of Socrates, and then the master of Aristotle. We're in the middle of our golden age here. Wrote 35 dialogues, 13 letters, hardly ever mentions himself in any of them. Everything he does is about Socrates. Well, not everything, but for the most part. Founded the academy, and his followers then came to be called academics after the school academy. His academy, I think, got its name from like a local gym where it happened to be constructed next to. So that's how it got its name. And then since that was called the academy, and his followers academics, and then what they did at the academy we called academia, and you see the roots for all those words now. So all comes from Plato's academy, even where we get the name for this school. Possibly the most influential philosopher of all time. A quote from our author: ignorance of them, meaning Plato's dialogues, is tantamount to ignorance of philosophy itself. And we're going to see that he's the first one to create a complete system of philosophy. The 5 major branches we were focusing on was metaphysics, the study of fundamental reality, fundamentally what is there, metaphysics, epistemology, what is truth and how can we come to know it, how do we come to know things and what can we come to know, maybe a better way to say that, ethics, which we briefly summarize as the morality of the individual, how an individual ought to live their life, politics might be thought of as the morality of the state, how the state ought to behave and the laws they ought to pass, and then finally aesthetics, the study of beauty. And so we'll briefly touch on Plato's position on each of these. We will not be doing any deep dives into any of his dialogues, unfortunately, because these positions are kind of scattered throughout his whole dialogues. And so rather than picking a few dialogues to dive into, I'm instead going to cover it in this order, covering one topic at a time. That's what I'm going to try to do. Now, while he did build a complete system of philosophy, he's the first one to do this, he was always critical of his system of philosophy. He never thought it was complete. He was still always working with it, questioning it. His whole theory of the forms that we're going to get to, he completely tears to shreds in one of his more famous dialogues called the Parmenides. So he always viewed his philosophy as a work in progress, never thought it was just done, complete, there it is.
Why would we consider Plato to be one of the greatest philosophers of all time? One of the 2 greatest philosophers of all time, when you're telling me also that he did not publish any of his own work or discoveries?
So the dialogues that he wrote were his own works. So Plato published those dialogues. He just used Socrates as a mouthpiece in those dialogues.
Why is he putting words in Socrates' mouth?
Eventually, yes. So with Plato's dialogues, we have what we call the early dialogues, we have what we call the middle dialogues, and then we have what we call the late dialogues. Now, in the early dialogues, these ones are thought to be Socratic dialogues, meaning that they're actually trying to portray Socrates as he was and Socrates' ideas. And you notice that in these dialogues, no conclusion is actually reached in the dialogue. These are the dialogues that start out with, what's your definition of courage? Da 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 da. And you see we contradicted our initial definition of courage. So what's your definition of courage? And the speaker says, Socrates, I'd love to keep talking about this, but I'm busy, I gotta go. and you never come to a conclusion. Those are the early dialogues, the Socratic dialogues. The middle dialogues, the most famous of these is the Republic. The middle dialogues are dialogues where now he's using Socrates as a mouthpiece. He's putting words into Socrates' mouth. He's no longer just explaining Socrates' ideas. And so now they start arguing towards conclusions, and he starts telling you what it is. And so if you read through the Republic, he's going to tell you exactly what is temperance, justice, courage, wisdom. We're going to actually define these things and tell you what they are. So those are his middle dialogues. His late dialogues that he wrote close to the end of his life seem to be more of a filling in the gaps type of dialogue. It's the pieces of his philosophy that he knew he didn't have holes for. It looks like he went and found people that had the best explanation to fill in that gap and used them as mouthpieces. So his Timaeus is one of these. His Timaeus is a Pythagorean explaining how the universe works. So these two have Socrates as a speaker. These ones, Socrates as a side character, and someone else does the talking. And that's roughly how his dialogues are broken up. That make sense? And then why is he considered one of the two most influential philosophers of all time? I think it's Whitehead who says it. Some famous philosopher says, all of philosophy is footnotes to Plato. Plato brought up every major question that there was and had a complete system of philosophy to touch on all these topics. And now everything else is just doing a deeper dive into what Plato already started. So he touched on everything, he gave us a complete system, he brought up all the important questions that philosophy ought to answer. And he's the first one to do that.
It seems like what's actually great about it is he wrote it down and connected many different philosophers' ideas into a cohesive model without maybe pretending to not be any of the authors of said philosophies.
Well, understand that the works that he wrote is different from necessarily. So even though he's never a speaker here, he still ran a school, ran an institution, he still taught people. So it's not like he wasn't pretending any of the ideas weren't his own.
Okay. All right.
So, but just the first one to build that complete system. And that system model, it becomes adopted from there on out. And people start working to develop these systems. These systems that have these different branches: metaphysics, epistemology, ethics, politics, aesthetics. If you don't cover at least those five, you didn't construct a complete system of philosophy. Okay. I think we covered all that. Any other questions? Okay. We already touched upon this last time. Real name was Aristocles. Plato was just a nickname, meaning broad. He was supposed to be tall with broad shoulders. Nickname given to him by his wrestling coach. Very well connected with the aristocracy. We remind ourselves of Plato's experience with politics early on in his life. So when he's a young man, that's when Athens loses the Peloponnesian Wars. The Spartans instantiate 30 tyrants to run Athens. A bunch of those tyrants who were put in power were friends and relatives of Plato. Plato was very well connected in terms of the aristocracy. And he had an opportunity to join in politics himself. Now they watch how the 30 tyrants, these 30 tyrants would have also been aristocrats just like Plato. They were his friends, his family. A bunch of these aristocrats were also people who would have been friends with and knew Socrates quite well. So he watched these 30 tyrants carrying out despicable acts in his mind. And on top of that, they tried to get Socrates to do it and threaten him under threat of death to do those bad acts. And Socrates wouldn't. But the point is, Plato watched his friends and family. When they came to power, he thought, finally, Athens is going to be run right. He had a very small opinion of the democracy that was just conquered by Sparta. After he sees how his friends and relatives behave, he says that democracy was like gold compared to what we have now. This is terrible. So his first chance to get into politics, and he's scared off from it. Now the 30 tyrants are overthrown, and the democracy comes back into power. And Plato is once again tempted to get back into politics. So what you do as a well-connected, young, aristocratic man. Get in politics. And once again, he watches one of the first things this new democracy does is accuse and kill Socrates. The very man who was defending you against the 30 tyrants. Who wouldn't betray you to the 30 tyrants. That's one of the things the 30 tyrants wanted him to do that he wouldn't do. And yet when they come back to power, they instantly start abusing that power, going after what he thought was just an obviously extremely moral man, Socrates. Couldn't believe it. So again, he was dissuaded from getting into politics. So after he had those two running with politics, he decided that his time was better spent going, traveling, and learning. So leaves Athens after the death of Socrates, spends his time traveling for 12 years, visiting around Greece, potentially Egypt, coming to learn things, know things. And after those 12 years, he ended up in Sicily at age 40. So started traveling around Athens at age 28. 12 years later, he's now 40. He's now in Sicily studying with the Pythagoreans. And he befriended a particular man by the name of Dion, who was the brother-in-law of a tyrant of Syracuse called Dionysus. So Syracuse is the most powerful city-state on Sicily. Very powerful city. He's there in Sicily, learning from the Pythagoreans. He becomes friends with Dion, who's the brother-in-law of Dionysus, the current tyrant of Syracuse. We're going to see him get pulled into politics again, in other words. Now, after he was there studying with Dion, he went back to Athens and he founded his academy. Later, Dionysus dies. And his son, Dionysus II, comes into power. So, Dion was a brother-in-law of Dionysus. So Dion is like the uncle to Dionysus II. So Dion hears some of Plato's ideas, and he says, here's your chance, Plato, to take some young mind who's willing to listen and train them to bring up the city-state correctly. That's the way that they're seeing it. So upon the death of Dionysus, Plato was invited by Dion to teach Dionysus II, the next tyrant of Syracuse, in hopes that something good would come out of it. Well, what ends up happening is people convince Dionysus that Dion is secretly trying to overthrow him, and that this is somehow part of a plot, and Plato somehow involved in this plot to overthrow Dionysus. And so, Plato ends up a prisoner there in Syracuse. He went there to help the kid, and he ends up a prisoner of the kid for a bit. So Dion was driven out of Syracuse. Plato was held as a prisoner to Dionysus II for a short period before he was allowed to return to Athens. Now, in that time that he was there in Syracuse, he made a good impression upon Dionysus II. And so even though he was held as a prisoner, made a good impression, Dionysus II actually kind of liked this guy Plato and thought that he had a lot of good things to say. And so he invites Plato back to Syracuse to advise him and to help him put his laws in order. And once again, Plato ended up on the wrong side of an issue, and Dionysus II ended up coming after him. And Plato was barely able to escape the city without getting captured and potentially losing his life. So he had 4 run-in with politics, and all 4 times it turned out awful. Never had a good experience with it. And so we're going to see politics is something at the center of his philosophy. A bunch of it is targeted at politics. If you go through and you read The Republic, his most influential work, a large portion of the book is dedicated to setting up your ideal city-state. Okay, so that's Plato with politics. Any questions about the life before we start the philosophy? Oh, I guess we didn't talk about the academy yet. So a little bit more on the academy. Founded in 387 BC, and it lasts a little over 300 years, lasts all the way until 83 BC. It was Sulla, Roman, who ultimately destroyed it. That's just a physical building. The actual school of thought continues well beyond him. Now, ironically enough, shortly after Plato's death, his school actually falls into skepticism. And the people that come and end up running the academy are skeptics. The very people that Socrates was arguing against from the beginning. And so the school falls into skepticism, but Platonism lives on. And so Platonism lives on. It becomes known by Middle Platonism. A few hundred years later, it becomes known as Neoplatonism. And it gets very tied up with Christianity early on. And Christianity and Platonism are very closely related until about the year 1200 AD. And so his book, the Timaeus, becomes second only to the Bible for a good stretch of history there, for a good 1,000 years. And then it's Thomas Aquinas who reorients Christendom more towards Aristotle as opposed to Plato. But early on, they're very Platonic. So huge influence in Christianity. Anyways, the academy here, it's the first higher education institution. Prior to this, what was your education? You went and got your musical education, you went and got your physical education, and that was your education. Now there's a place that you can go and actually continue your education.
What about the the Sophists?
You could go learn from the Sophists. So, and they would teach you how to be persuasive. But it wasn't some institution that you could go attend. You could go hire a tutor. It wasn't standard education provided for you by the state.
Was this provided by the state?
Sorry, shouldn't have said it that way. It wasn't a standard institution that you could go to and say, come to the sophist school where we teach you sophistry. So the academy is the first institution like that. Now, there are some similar models. It's always a gradual transition, so it's always a little bit hard to say this is the first. This is often recognized at the first. But we've already seen stuff like this kind of developing, like with the Pythagoreans. They had sort of their little cults that they had going, and you could come and be introduced and start studying. And so there were similar things going on, and it was a gradual evolution. Not suddenly there was nothing that boomed the academy, but recognized as the first. Now, inscribed above the entrance to the academy was supposed to be, let none ignorant of geometry enter here. Why did he have that? So he was worried about undisciplined minds studying philosophy too soon. He was afraid that they would just take their understanding of philosophy and use it to bamboozle their opponents. Right? He was worried that they would be more focused on seeming like they knew much than they would be on actually learning. In particular, watch what happened with Socrates. Socrates would go do his dialectic method. Some young youths would watch him, and they go imitate him, infuriating the city. So he wants you to be well-versed in reasoning before we delve into philosophy. And geometry is a very safe ground for studying. If you make a mistake in geometry, it is demonstrably wrong. And I can demonstrate to you how you're wrong and show you exactly where your thinking went wrong. And so you can think and practice thinking, get good at basically applying logic and deductive reasoning. And then when you're well skilled at that, and you show that you're able to mentally endure and carefully consider an idea to come to these conclusions, then you're ready for these higher programs. So that's why he wanted you to know geometry more. He has a book in the Republic, I think it's book 8, a good section of it is dedicated to how he thinks citizens ought to be educated. So I'll give you a taste of that. This is largely what people use to try and guess what the curriculum might have been at the academy. So in the Republic, he flat out says, starting at the age of 20, you ought to spend a decade studying arithmetic, then planar geometry, then solid geometry, then astronomy/motion. It's weird that might be weird to us that he says astronomy here. What do you mean astronomy? He's saying studying motion, linear motion, astronomy being just a concrete example of it, how things are actually moving in the skies. And then here, harmonics, he's not talking about learning how to play music. He's talking about studying the motion of strings, studying repetitive motion. So if we were to say this in more modern terms, he would say study your algebra, study your geometry, know your analytic geometry, study Newtonian mechanics, and then study wave mechanics. That would be a more modern way of saying what you should study.
A decade seems like a long time.
Yes, it does seem like a long time to study all those things. But that's what he puts on it. We don't know what the whole program would have been, but he definitely says a decade inside the Republic. In particular, he was under the impression that so at the time, solid geometry wasn't well developed. So he assumed that as you were studying these things, you're also pushing forward the field of knowledge. You're not just given a book and here, go learn this book. So that probably helps establish the intuition a bit better.
Did he ever explain why he felt that his ideas were so rejected in politics? Like the reasoning behind that? Did he ever go into why that was the case?
Why his ideas were so rejected?
In politics.
We'll have a lot to say about his politics down the road.
And then next question is when did he actually become famous or very popular? Was it after his death?
Plato catches on quick. His academy becomes famous.
Okay.
And you have all sorts of great minds coming to his academy early on.
So
Most notably
would've
Aristotle.
been a little bit more successful later in his life in politics rather than without reputation.
So all that stuff going on with Dion, or Dionysius the Younger, was when he was around age 60.
Oh.
Yeah.
Okay.
Remember, the first time he was in Syracuse, it's when the father was in power. The second time he's in Syracuse, it's when the son is in power. So I told that like it's one event after the other, but they're separate at a time. Anything else? Okay. With that, let's start jumping into his philosophy. First is metaphysics. Now, in short, what he's going to argue for is that there exist two different types of worlds. There's a world up above, not really up above, it's in no direction, it's outside this universe, which we're going to call the world of forms. And then there's this world that we live in. Now, up here in this world exist universals. In this world exist particulars. In other words, chairness exists up here. Chairs, a bunch of particular chairs exist down here. So you have a concept of what it means to be a chair in your head. That's not some physical thing. You can't show me chair. You can show me that chair, you can show me that chair, but you can't show me something that's just chair. So those universals, those things that you can't show me directly, you can only show me instances of, that's what we mean by universals. Those exist up here in the world of forms. And then down here exists all the particular instances of it. The things down here are physical, three-dimensional things. The things up here do not exist in time and space. They don't change. They're not physical things that you can touch, pull, anything like that. So two completely different worlds.
Did they ever talk about the need for the world of form to exist?
The need for it has to exist. So we're going to give you some arguments for why this picture has to be the case. I'm going to walk you through 4 of his arguments for that. So briefly speaking, here's what we're going to be arguing for. Chairness exists here. Individual chairs exist down here. You can experience with your 5 senses things here. You experience with your mind's eye. You see with your mind's eye the things here. When I'm doing some proof and you finally say, oh, I see, you're not saying you physically experience it. You're saying you see. You just had a window into the world of forms. For a second there, you got that glimpse. So this is what thought is about. This is what sensory experiences are about. These two worlds. And so we're going to be arguing for the existence of these two worlds. Okay. So in a nutshell, that's what we're arguing for. Now let's get some detail. So first off, he completely agreed with Socrates that knowledge is ultimately based in knowledge of universals. Anytime you tell me something you know, it's in terms of universals. Even when you describe what you know about a particular object, you still do it in terms of universals. If you were to tell someone about Donald Timpson, what would you tell him? You might tell him he's a teacher. That's universal. You might tell him he's 5'9". That's universal. You might tell him he's a bit animated with his hands. That's universal. Whatever classifications you might make about me, those are all universals. And anytime you give a definition, something that you know, you say, what is this? If it's well defined, you can give a definition of it. Definitions only apply to universals. We have a definition of cat. We don't have a definition of sprinkles. Meaning my cat sprinkles, not sprinkles that you dump on something. Or whatever. So, all knowledge is completely based in universals. Even in describing particulars, you do it in terms of universals. So you can't separate knowledge and universals. All knowledge about universals. Good? Now, while Socrates limited himself to matters of ethics, Plato once again wants to resolve Parmenides and Heraclitus' metaphysics into one. So Socrates was okay. Socrates wasn't out to claim what he knew. He just had this strong belief and then kept showing how you didn't really know. Plato wants to actually construct a system. So we got to start from scratch again. We got to deal with Parmenides, who says, in a world of logic, there is no change, and with Heraclitus. Heraclitus who says if there's change, then we can't have logic. So once again, we have to reconcile Parmenides and Heraclitus' metaphysics into one. We got to start from ground zero again, and we want to do it in such a way that we are consistent with Socrates. So that's what he's out to do. Now, the closest attempt we've had to something like this before was the atomists. So the atomists had their metaphysics. All that exists are atoms in the void, right? And everything else, all those qualitative properties that you think you experience, those exist only in your mind, completely subjective. So that was their metaphysics. Their metaphysics says you are just atoms in motion. Whatever you're going to do, you're going to do. Everything's predetermined. Yet you go listen to, you go say their ethics is make better choices. So their metaphysics says choice is an illusion. Everything's predetermined. Their ethics says, but make better choices. They say all that exists are atoms in the void, but their epistemology led towards, or was based in skepticism. You can't know anything, but all that exists are atoms in the void. I'm sure of it. Completely inconsistent with each other. So we've had people kind of putting at these systems of philosophy together before. Plato's going to be the first one to actually build out the full system in a consistent way. He's very conscious of what he's doing. He's not just giving his opinion on different ideas as he goes. He's going to actually try building out the full system. That's why he's so influential. He's largely the first one to do this. You look like you're about to say something, no? Okay, sorry. So, talks about the atoms. Okay, so Plato's out to resolve Parmenides and Heraclitus while maintaining consistent epistemology, ethics, politics, and aesthetics. So whatever his metaphysics is that he comes up with, it has to be consistent with all these other fields. Otherwise he's failed. And this ethics has to agree with what Socrates set out. And he also has to vindicate the good, the true, the beautiful, objective and absolute. Now, his metaphysics rests on two basic premises. Premise one, all knowledge is about things that actually exist. You can make a basic Parmenidean argument for this, for thou canst not know what is not. All knowledge is about things that actually exist. If your knowledge is about nothing, it's not knowledge. Now you might say something like, what about something like I say, who's Harry Potter's best friend? No? Bad example. Who destroys the ring? Gollum? You can say Gollum or Frodo. The point is, you think that these questions can be answered. Are these questions about reality? What does Lord of the Rings have to do with reality? What does Harry Potter have to do with reality? So is all knowledge really based in reality? Plato would still say, yes, yes. You're just asking a bad question. I don't say, I know Harry Potter's best friend is Ron. That's not the way you say it. You say, I know that in a book written by J.K. Rowling, there is a character whose name is Harry Potter who it's said is supposed to be friends with Ron. And in that sense, your knowledge is about something actual in reality, something that actually exists. So even if you start thinking about, well, what about this fantasy stuff or whatever else, some play that was written, it's still coming back to reality. All knowledge is about things that actually exist. That's premise one. That make sense? It's very important that we understand these two premises. We're going to make lots of reference to it. Premise two. Universals must be knowable. We've already talked about this one. All our knowledge is in terms of universals. Every definition you talk about, it's a definition of a universal. Any way you try to describe something that you know, you describe it in terms of universals. Anytime you try to exchange knowledge with someone, it's in terms of universals. So if anything is knowable, universals must be knowable. And so you put these two together, since universals are knowable, they must somehow exist in reality. We're setting up for universals exist here, in reality. That's what we're working towards. Taking you through a thinking leading up to that. So, since universals must exist somehow in reality, the next natural question is, where and in what sense, then, do universals exist? Where does the redness exhibited by a fire truck and a fire hydrant exist? Sorry, debating whether I should introduce that idea right here or if it comes later. This redness existing, your knowledge, I'll come at it later, I'm sure. All right. So Plato gives several arguments for why there must be two distinct worlds. A world of particulars, which is we currently inhabit, that's this world that we have around us, and then a world of universals, a world of forms up here, accessible only to our mind or our soul. The one that we see with our mind's eye, which he called the world of forms. Now, he actually called it ideas in his actual dialogues. In modern times, we always say forms, because typically when you think about an idea, you think about a subjective experience. He's talking about forms, things that actually exist in reality. So that's why we switch out those words. So if you're reading a dialogue and you keep hearing the idea of, we mean the form. That's where it comes from. All right, so how does this first argument go? Universals can't just be part of particulars. So I say, where do these universals exist? Where does redness exist? Your first thought might be, well, it exists in the fire hydrant, and it exists in the fire truck, and it exists in that little red ball. That's where redness exists. It exists in all these particulars, right? That's a natural place to say that exists. Plato says, no. Universals can't just be part of particulars. In the same way that you know two particulars are completely separate things, you can also classify universals and particulars as completely separate things. For example, how do you know that this and this are two separate things?
They have different properties.
Yeah, you might say one's white, one's black. You might say one weighs 2 ounces, one weighs 20 ounces. You might say one's composed of chalk, one's composed of plastic. If they have completely contrary properties, then they can't be the same thing. Furthermore, they don't only have, if they have somewhat contradictory properties, like this is entirely white and this is entirely black, I now know that this chalk can't somehow exist as part of this. In the same way that this marker lid exists as part of the whole marker, if you want to think about that as a marker, or my head exists as a part of me. How can I be sure that this chalk doesn't exist as a part of this plastic container? It's because they have completely opposed properties. So it's not enough that they just have different properties. Their properties have to be opposed to each other somehow. This is completely white, this is completely black. Something can't be part white and completely black. So they have to be two completely separate entities. So in a similar manner, we're going to show that universals and particulars cannot be the same types of things. They're completely different. And therefore, universals cannot exist just as part of particulars. Don't need that example, good enough one. So Plato does the same thing with universals and particulars. He demonstrates that they have drastically different properties. We'll see the difference here, but once he shows that they have drastically different properties, we now know that universals, if I can show that universals and particulars are in fact different things, then the question naturally then becomes, then where are the universals? They don't exist as part of the particular things. We only see particular things in this world. If the universals don't exist as the particular things, they must exist somewhere where there aren't particular things. In some different world. In some world of universals. So how are we convinced that these are two completely separate things and that a universal isn't actually just a part of a particular? So how do universals and particulars differ? Well, consider plurality versus one. There's many triangles. There's many particular things that resemble triangles. There's one triangularity. If you ask me to prove that the angle sum of a triangle is 180 degrees, and I say, okay, here's the proof, and you say, well, you proved it for that triangularity. What about the other triangularity? That's a dumb question. There's only one triangularity. What are you talking about? So when it comes to the universals, there's only one. But when it comes to things that resemble triangles, how many things are there out there? Arbitrarily many. Humans versus humanity. I say that's a crime against humanity. You say, well, maybe against this humanity, but not against that humanity. No, crime against humanity is a crime against humanity. There's only one humanity. But there's many humans. The universal is the one in the many particulars. It's what relates them all together. So plurality versus one. We only have one universal, we have many particulars. That's one way that they're drastically different from each other. 2, motion or change. Remember, motion, those are kind of synonymous in a sense. Or rest or unchanging. A particular thing in this universe is changing all the time. I take this chalk, I wipe it, some of it is decomposing, some's falling off. Everything's moving around. You right now, you have each one of your cells. If I were to zoom in on any little piece of you, some cell, there's all sorts of activity going on in there. You are constantly changing all the time. So particulars seem to exist in this Heraclitean flux. While universals, on the other hand, are always the same. If I go back in time 500 years, and I do a proof that the angle sum of any triangle is 180 degrees, and then I bring it to you now, you say that proof was good 500 years ago. It doesn't work anymore. Triangularity's changed. It's not what it used to be. No, triangularity doesn't change. Universals don't change. Mathematical proof today is just as good as it was yesterday, is just as good as it is tomorrow. So these universals are unchanging. On the other hand, particulars are constantly changing, in every respect, all the time. So again, they must be completely different types of things. They're completely separate. Thirdly, physical versus abstract. I can hold a red marker, That's easy. I can't hold redness. You say, go pick up redness. Someone holds up a red marker. No, that's not what I said. Go hold redness. Or I can hold two equal lengths of wood. I say these are the same length. Okay, now go pick up equality. Forget the wood. I just want the equality. Bring that to me. It's not a physical thing. And then finally, how they are known. Particulars are known by the senses, while universals are known by the reason, known by the mind. How do I know any particular thing? I touch it, smell it, taste it, sniff it, whatever. That's how I know it. That's how I know the particulars. Whereas universals, I can teach you about in a classroom without ever showing you one. You know 2 plus 2 is 4. Show me 2. These are fingers. I want you to just show me 2. And so, 2 is only known by the mind. And when you know that 2 plus 2 is 4, that's something that's only known by studying these universals, universal 2. So, there's our list of things on how these particulars and universals are completely different from each other. And since they have completely different properties, it is not possible that universals just exist as part of particulars. They must actually be completely separate entities. Therefore, those entities, those universal entities, they must exist somewhere. They don't exist in this world, so there must be some other world where they exist. Now, a better way to say that more times is they don't exist in this universe, so they must exist somewhere outside the universe, in some other place. Now, that place doesn't necessarily have dimensions of space or dimensions of time, but it's just somewhere else that that thing actually exists. Not in this universe. That's what we mean by a separate world of forms. 2 worlds. Our world and some other world. We don't mean some other planet somewhere in the universe. So that's one argument. Next argument. Comes from an argument from our knowledge of perfections. Where do we get our knowledge of perfections? Perceptible things, the things in this world, change. And things that change cannot be perfect. Now, he means this in kind of 2 different ways. For one, imagine for a second I actually did poof into existence a perfect sphere. The second it comes into existence, it changes a little bit. It's no longer perfect. Perfections don't exist in this universe. There's a second way he means perfect, and in these dialogues. Remember, I'm summing up a bunch of arguments from dialogues and common themes of arguments. Another way that he often uses that is, a perfect man would be a man who wants for nothing. There is nothing left to be desired, nothing else to want. You're completely perfect. You don't need to drink water. Your thirst is perfectly satisfied. You don't need to eat. Your hunger is perfectly satisfied. You don't need to learn. Your knowledge is perfectly satisfied. There's nothing to drive you to do anything. Much how Christians view God. Just nothing to do. So in that sense, perfect things don't change, don't move. There's nothing for them to try and accomplish, try and do. So perfect comes up those 2 ways. Now it's even worse than that. Furthermore, there are no perceptibles of many of the abstractions, of the abstract concepts that we have perfect notions of. There's no such thing as a perfect triangle. Let me try and give you a triangle. Is that a perfect triangle? No, it's even worse than that. That's not even a triangle. What's a triangle? It's a 2-dimensional planar figure. That is chalk on a whiteboard. That's sticking out of the whiteboard, son. If I'm going to get closer, I got to get rid of how it sticks out of the whiteboard. All right, we're a lot closer now. I got rid of the chalk sticking out of the whiteboard. We're closer to a triangle. Where's 2? This is fingers. Show me 2. So we don't even have perceptions of a bunch of these abstractions. So, furthermore, there's no perceptibles of many of these abstract concepts that we have perfect notions of. I could give you a definition of a triangle and you can completely understand it. There you go, you know what a triangle is. Where does that knowledge come from? So, a bunch of those things don't even exist. There's no such thing as a perceptible triangle or any perception of perfectly equal lengths. There's another one. You have a notion of what it means for things to be 2 equal lengths. You bring me 2 pieces of wood and you said, here they go, they're equal lengths. Well, let's perfectly measure the length of one thing and perfectly measure the length of the other thing. Are they going to be exactly equal if we can get perfect measurement? No, no chance. Even if you shave it down to the exact atoms, you got the problem that those pesky electrons aren't holding still. So, we never have a perfect example of equals, and yet you completely understand what equals are. We never even have an instance of a triangle in this universe, and yet you understand what a triangle is. Where do our knowledge of these forms come from if we never have any direct experience with them? We must have knowledge of perfections, for we often call things imperfect, and so perfections must exist. We have knowledge about them. Remember one of our premises. If it's knowable, it exists. Knowledge is about reality, things that actually exist. You know about these things, they must exist. Thus, perfections exist, and all these abstractions that we're talking about, and yet they do not exist in this world around us. So they have to exist. They don't exist in this world, so where do they exist? They must exist in some other world, the world of forms. Thus, perfections exist in the same world as universals, the world of forms. If the perfections are not part of this world, how did we obtain knowledge of them? So I'll introduce you just a touch of his epistemology here. How did you ever come to know these things? Plato says, you existed as a soul up here. And you had direct experience of these things and came to know them. And then when you come down here, the perceptibles you see around you, they remind you of things that you saw up here. So his metaphysics also gives us the foundations for his arguments. One of the things he's going to argue for is the immortality of the soul. And one of the arguments he's going to give is that you have knowledge of these things. You could have done it here. So where'd you get your knowledge of these things? You must have at some point been here. Make sense? We'll have a lot more to say about how he thinks that happens, but I want to show you some of his metaphysical framework for his arguments for the immortality of the soul. So, therefore, not only is there another world of forms, but we are born into this world with innate ideas. Those ideas are already in us. We came with those ideas. You didn't learn about equality here. You were born with that already built into you somehow. You experienced it before you were born. That's when you came into contact with it. This also implies that the soul must be able to exist independent of the body, obviously. Any questions on the second argument? Argument from perfections?
It's not entirely related, but I am curious if he believed in the atoms and particle theories that existed in this same time.
When it comes to the explanation of the universe that he gives in the Timaeus, it most closely resembles what the Pythagoreans thought. Now, whether that was Plato's own view, or he simply understood that he was lacking in that respect, and so he's going to just go have some authority speak on the topic. Because Socrates isn't the one speaking in the Timaeus. It's a man called Timaeus, who's a Pythagorean, given the Pythagorean view. So, I think where he saw that his philosophy wasn't fleshed out, he went and piggybacked off of the best things he could find and fit them in with his philosophy.
Did he ever include the philosophy? I can't remember the name.
Atomists.
Atomists, is that it?
Yeah.
Did he ever include those?
He did not include atomic theory.
That's too bad.
Because atomic theory is, its whole premise is, look, essentially he's saying, here's our Parmenidean universe. It's the world of forms. That's where nothing changes. That's what all knowledge is about. Here's what is. What was the atomist view? No, you take a physical Parmenidean ball, and you take a sledgehammer to it, and throw it around in the void. That's what's real. So, completely different views.
True.
He's going to say that this is real reality, this is what we know about. The atomist view is, no, real reality are those little atoms.
And there's nothing more.
And there's nothing we can know. And it's just all random atoms in motion. So his view is going to be closest to the Pythagorean view of the people that have come before, other than obviously Socrates. Okay, any other questions before argument 3? All right, our third argument. Which do we come to understand first? Universals or particulars? We can't abstract universals from particulars because this presupposes we know which particulars to abstract from. So, let me give you an example. What do you know first? Chairness or individual chairs? Now you might think, well, I go and I experience a bunch of individual chairs. I see what all those chairs have in common. and then I abstract that away, and I call that chairness. And that's how I come to know chairness. You take a bunch of particular instances before your mind, and then abstract away from those instances to some universal. So first you come to know the particulars, and from the particular you come to understand the universal. That might be some thought process that you have. Very likely. Plato is going to say, no. So an example, you might say, if you want to know a universal like cat, you collect before your mind a bunch of particular instances of cats, and then abstract away what they all have in common. And there you come to know what the word cat means, and what the universal cat is. Okay, if that's how you define things, I'm going to give you a new word to define. Suppose I ask you now to define food. I want the definition of food. And you say, how am I supposed to do that? You didn't tell me what food means. I say, it's easy. I'm going to go find a bunch of particular instances of food, abstract away what they all have in common, and tell me what that is. And that's what food means. Now you see the problem. Which instances do you go and abstract from? I have to tell you what food means before you can go find a bunch of instances to abstract away what food means. If you went and found someone who didn't know the English language, and you asked them, what's chair? Give me the definition, they don't know where to begin. And you, using what you already know about chair, go and give them a bunch of instances first. So you had to know the universal before you could find the particulars that you get your definition from to begin with. So you might be tempted to say the particulars come first, or Plato says, no, the universals come first. You know universals, then you know particulars. And so you already have chairness. You got that idea in your head right here. And when you come along and you see individual chairs, they remind you of that universal that was already in your head. The analogy that's given is, long after high school, you might forget about Brad. But then later, you see a picture of Jake, and you remember, oh yeah, he was friends with that Brad guy. I remember, I went to school with him. In like manner, you forget about chairness as that newborn baby, but as you come to experience chairs, you're like, oh yeah, I remember you. I saw you once. And then once you have that recollection in your mind, you're able to do something amazing. I can go take from behind my back, whip out something, and say, what is that? And you could all say, it's a chair. One that you've never seen before. And you just magically knew it was a chair. It's amazing. How did you know? No one told you. You just noticed that it resembles that thing. It's reminding you of that chairness you already knew. So you already saw chairness. And all these are just images and shadows of that chairness. We'll have more to say about that later. But so that's how you knew. It's amazing that you can do that. And you'll all be agreed. I can take a red object that none of you have ever seen before, whip it out, say what color, and you'll all say red. It's amazing. How'd you know? Because you came in contact with redness. And now it's causing you to recollect. And so you can have knowledge about particulars that you've never even seen before to abstract from to begin with. You see the problem. Universals gotta come first, right? Therefore, in order to,
Yes.
We'll see what Aristotle has to say.
I mean, if you look at, if I say, this is chair, this is chair, this is chair, and your brain starts picking out similar properties, and then I say, hey, what's this? And I say, it's chair. And in a way, I don't know.
Well, yeah, that was because after 3 instances, you're pretty well reminded of chairness.
Or you could say, hey, a chair is something you can sit on, or it has 3 legs or 4 legs. And I go around look for all things that have 4 legs, and I can say, okay, classify,
And then you come back with that donkey,
Yeah, I was gonna say horse.
and everyone's confused.
Obviously, I would need
I know.
a definition, but yeah, gotcha.
Anyways. So, therefore, in order to recognize a particular instance of a universal, to recognize something as being one of those universals, you had to already know what that universal is. You're saying, once you give me a definition of chair, I can go find chairs. That presupposes the question. We were looking for a definition of chairs. So we need to abstract from those things. So you see the problem? You got to pick which instances you're going to abstract from first. How do you pick which ones to abstract from? You already need the notion in your head. So says Plato. Therefore, in order to recognize a particular instance of a universal, a particular instance of a cat, for example, we must already know the universal cat. We must already somehow have that knowledge within us. Since we recognize instances, we, meaning our souls, must have come to know these universals prior to this life in some other world, namely the world of forms. So you must already have knowledge of universals. You didn't get it here. So you must have gotten it before you got here. So you must have been somewhere else, world of forms, where you had direct experience with those universals. Whatever direct experience would look like in that world. I don't know. Okay, our last argument for these two different worlds. We know that reality is knowable. Premise 1. That much is granted. Remember, those two premises he uses to kick off all of his metaphysics. So, what must reality be like for knowledge to be possible? We know knowledge is possible of reality. So what does this imply reality must actually be like? Heraclitus and Parmenides agreed that a world of change implies a contradiction. And if contradictions are allowable, then nothing can be known. How can nothing be known if contradictions are allowable? Let's say that I know that James is a trireme. Well, the contradiction is James is not a trireme. What do I know about James now if he both is and is not a trireme? Nothing. So we can't have contradictions if we're going to have knowledge. So say again. Heraclitus and Parmenides agreed that change implies a contradiction. If contradictions are allowed, then nothing is knowable. Therefore, if knowledge is possible, reality must be composed of some unchanging entities. If there's something that can be known, there must be something that's unchanging. Because change implies a contradiction. How does change imply a contradiction? Remember Tim the caterpillar becoming the butterfly. He both is and is not the butterfly. You both have and don't have what you started with. You have what you started with, namely you have Tim, but you don't have what you started with, namely a caterpillar. Or we might watch Barley up until now and say he's a just man. Next second he murders you. He's an unjust man. He both is and is not a just man. Change implies a contradiction. It allows contradictions to exist. So therefore, if knowledge is possible, reality must be composed of some unchanging entities. Because reality is knowable, and contradictions stop things from being knowable. Furthermore, the Sophists say that perceptions of perceptibles are flawed. Remember what the Sophists argued for skepticism. They say all our sensory perceptions are flawed, both by the object that we're actually seeing it with, the medium that we're using, like for example my eyeball. So my eyeball could in some way be defective, and then I could just, or I could be seeing somehow a defunct object, causing me to come to bad conclusions. So basically, Sophists are saying what we know depends both on our sensory apparatus and the thing being viewed. And so we get flawed perceptions of how reality is. So Sophists say that perceptions of perceptibles are always flawed. We cannot rely on our physical senses to communicate knowledge to us. So putting all these together, what do we get? Plato agrees. Since knowledge is possible, then there must exist some unchanging reality that our knowledge is ultimately based in. Parmenides says there must be an unchanging reality. Plato says you're right, Parmenides, there it is. Heraclitus says change implies a contradiction, which means that we can't know about it. Plato says yes, here's where change occurs. And all our knowledge is not about the stuff here, all our knowledge is about here. So it doesn't matter that contradictions are allowed here, we don't get contradictions here. So Parmenides, we got a world for you. Heraclitus, we got a world for you. Similarly, the Sophists come along and they say, all our sense perceptions don't give us true knowledge. Plato says, sure enough, all our sense perceptions are about this world right here. But what you see with your mind's eye, that's not sense perception. Your reasoning, that doesn't deceive you. All your reasoning is about this world. And this is what you come to know. And so he's got everyone taken care of. He's dealt with Parmenides, he's dealt with Heraclitus, and he's dealt with the Sophists. See it? Any questions about that so far? That's his overarching framework. So Plato agrees, since knowledge is possible, then there must exist an unchanging reality that our knowledge is ultimately based in, the world of forms. Furthermore, since our physical senses cannot communicate knowledge to us, we must come to understand it purely through our reason, and not through our sensory experiences. Our sensory experiences might help us recollect something, but it wasn't necessary that we had those sensory experiences to recollect. It can be useful, it can be helpful, but it's not necessary. We could have gotten by without it. Maybe seeing Jake will help you remember that guy Ben that you went to school with, but if you just thought hard enough, you probably could have remembered Ben anyways. He's just saying Jake helps. Seeing the chairs helps you come to understand chairness, but you didn't have to see the chairs to know chairness. You could have just thought really hard about it.
Doesn't that mean that everybody has all knowledge at all times?
Everybody is in some sense endowed with all knowledge. The same way that you are in some sense endowed with your memories.
And if you don't need to recollect it, if you don't need to see something to remember it, then why isn't everybody at the same level of knowledge?
Seeing something can help you recollect it.
Right, but if it's
So
not,
I can help you along in your path of recollecting more faster by showing you clever diagrams that we call proofs or whatever. That wasn't necessary. You could have just sat there and thought by yourself. You would have made progress slower. You would have recollected slower, but it was still possible. And you could have, with enough time, effort, and energy, come to know all the things that you knew before. Assuming that everything you knew before was infinite. I'm not sure about that.
it would have to be movement.
Likely. I don't know. I get the reasoning to saying it is. I don't know what Plato ever said it was, is what I mean by I don't know. Anyways. Yeah. Make sense?
He's saying that our knowledge of things comes from the world of forms.
All knowledge is about the world of forms.
And yet, I've always had this idea with the thought experiment, like if I was born into the world in complete darkness and there's no ability to sense or know anything through my senses, there would be no way for me to comprehend anything as a thought experiment. And I was curious if he addresses that. It seems like a lot of what we come to know is actually through our experiences, through our senses.
So experiences can be a very useful tool in helping you. It's not technically necessary.
But if
Now, even if it takes you 80 years of being in darkness by yourself to finally have that first notion of something, the amount of time is irrelevant. The point is it should be theoretically possible.
And he's able to explain that logically, how that communicates.
Well, his explanation is that you are born with the universals in you. You already, in some sense, have knowledge of them. And so it's just about somehow bringing them out of you. And your experiences are useful in bringing them out of you. And maybe he would say a few basic experiences are necessary, but not all of them are necessary. I don't have to see a particular instance of something for me to already comprehend that something. Just a few is enough to already get my mind going, and I can just reason about those things. And so I never need to see a sofa. You could say it's like 4 chairs that we hook together somehow. Ah, yes, I recall that now. Sofa, of course.
That's just implying that, like, someone who is colorblind could see the color that they're blind towards, and they've never seen their life.
Not that they can see it, that they can understand it.
That's what I'm saying. They can't. Someone's colorblind can never understand that color. It's just,
They understand their version of what they see when they see that color.
Yeah, but when they
But is it the
they
same
give them the
thing as-
glasses that let them see it, they're just shocked, you know, and it's something that they could have.
Well, being colorblind, it might be, since you've never seen a color, that you can have no concept of color at all. I don't know. Maybe you're just colorblind to one color.
That's what I was implying. But that one color would be impossible. I don't care if you're a million years into it. My theory would, I guess that's my.
How do you
I don't want to so
like,
much.
how do you
Plato.
reason what a blind person sees? How do you reason that? How do you think about that so hard that you understand it?
So it could be the case that you have to have some experience of color to begin to start recollecting colors. But eventually, with only a few instances, you come to start recognizing things as having that universal that you've never seen before. But it goes back to his first argument. What comes first, the universals or the particulars? If the universals have to come first, where'd you get the knowledge of those universals? If you didn't get them here, you had to get them here. And in some sense, sensory experiences help stimulate it in you somehow. Help you recollect. Are there some things that maybe it's impossible to recollect without certain sensory experiences? Maybe. I don't know.
Okay.
But ultimately, it was somehow in you the whole time. But we'll have a lot more to say about his epistemology next, after his metaphysics. But anyway, so we've got our 2 worlds, the world of form and this world. Furthermore, all true knowledge is knowledge of the world of forms, since this is the only knowledge that is possible. Because this world is always changing.
Right.
And change implies a contradiction, and with contradictions, nothing can be done. So everything we can have about this world is opinion at best. No knowledge down here. Next slide. Now, all mathematical objects are universals, and so all mathematical knowledge is true knowledge, and it's about the stuff up here.
Right.
And so the academy has this very heavy tint towards math, and studying math. And they view this as a very useful practice ground for coming to study philosophy in general. Because you're very much focused on the same ideas. Let's focus on the universals of mathematics, where demonstrations are very easy, and then we'll talk about universals in general, and come to know the world of forms as a whole. We'll study this small part of it that we call geometry, and then we'll study the whole. So, Plato has answered Heraclitus with the changing world. He's answered Parmenides with the world that no change occurs in, and the skeptics with this two-world approach. There's an intelligible world of universals called the world of forms, and then the physical, sensible world, composed of particulars, this world. The forms exist independent of man's mind and independent of this universe. If this whole universe ceases to be, 2 plus 2 is still 4. That exists as a connection in the world of forms. 2 is what 2 is, independent of this universe. It doesn't exist in your mind. It doesn't exist as part of this universe. It exists independent of this universe. Even though they're not physical, Plato still envisioned these forms as actual entities. Kind of like the soul. How most people would imagine a soul exists, or a spirit exists. It doesn't occupy physical space, but it still exists, somehow, some way. Can't touch it, smell it, taste it.
Could it be physical in that universe, in the world of forms?
Potentially, this, well, I don't know. I don't think he in any way envisioned these as being physical things. But they are actual existing entities. Whatever the dimensions of this universe are, they're not space and time.
Right.
I don't know how to envision anything else. But there's something different. Furthermore, there is a form for every single universal in existence. So there's a form for justice, courage, 2, as well as hair, mud, and dirt.
What about stuff we haven't invented yet?
There's a universal for it. This is one of the ways that he attacks himself. He doesn't like how there's universals of everything. So this is one of the things he's always critiquing about himself, is the fact he doesn't like the fact that there's a universal for mud, a universal for garbage, a universal for being a coward.
We might get a set theory problem where there's a universal for a universal.
You do get that. We call it the third man argument. So you say, well, we haven't gotten through how these resemble each other yet, so we're not ready for that. But plus we'll cover it with Aristotle. So since definitions depend on the essence of a thing, and since essences don't change, then the forms don't change.
Right.
The essence of a thing can never change. Definitions have to get the essence. Now, we've already touched on this a little bit. One of the earlier definitions of man is that he's a featherless biped, an animal that walks on 2 legs. Now, it may have been the case that when that person said that definition, that every single thing in existence that was a featherless biped happened to be a man. And so it did actually describe all men in reality. That's not good enough. It has to get the essence of a thing if it's going to be an actual definition. So some clever guy plucked the chicken and said, behold, man, a featherless biped. No, that doesn't work. A featherless biped is not a valid definition for man. It has to get to the essence of a thing. And the essence of a thing doesn't change, so these universals don't change. So we've set up our 2 worlds. We have our world of universals and our world of particulars. This looks a little bit like that 2-column thing we did with the Pythagoreans. Yeah. World of universals, there's one of each thing. World of particulars, there's many. World of universals, everything is at rest. There's no change. There's no motion. This world, it's constantly in motion. World of universals, it's eternal. Triangularity always has been and always will be what triangularity is. It's eternal. This world, things are temporal. Particulars come and go all the time. Triangularity is always the same. Universals, non-physical. This world, physical. Universals are only known by thought, only known by your mind's eye. This world is only known by senses. We should probably say experienced by senses, because nothing can be known in this world. Now, the next question is, which of these worlds is the real world?
Did Plato have did he have a story for how the universe began?
Yes. So that we'll get to that with the Timaeus. But first, let's talk about which of these worlds are real, and then we'll talk about how they relate to each other and how things came into existence. So, he's going to argue, we're going to make arguments for which of these worlds are the real world. Which one's more real? Which one do we, if we have to call something reality, which one's the real reality? This world or this world?
What do you mean they're real?
Which one's more real? Let's break it down, and we'll look at the different ways that we use real, and see if it applies better to this world or this world. And we're going to see that here's our real reality. It's over here. And we're going to call this somehow just a shadow of reality, and we'll make that analogy make sense. Let's think about the way we use real. For a thing to exist, it cannot be contradictory, which implies it doesn't change. For a thing to exist, for a thing to be real, it cannot be contradictory. Right? Yeah. If I say James both is and isn't a trireme, James is nothing. What is he? I don't know. Nothing. For a thing to exist, it cannot be contradictory. Change implies a contradiction, and so, if it can't be contradictory, it can't change. The things in this world, both are and are not. We have change going on in this world all the time. And so, with respect to that, it looks like the world of forms is more real than this world. There's no change there, there is change here. There's no contradictions there, there's contradictions here. In that sense, the world of forms is more real than this world. Let's look at another sense. Only real things can be known. Going back to our initial premise, all knowledge is about really existing things. We have knowledge of the world of forms, but we have no knowledge of this world. We have opinion at best of this world. We don't have any knowledge of this world. So in that sense, the world of forms is more real than this world. It's the one that's knowable. Let's go on to another one. We say the real is the more perfect. Use this in your daily language all the time. You eat something, you say, now that's real apple pie. It's in some way the superior apple pie. The more perfect apple pie. Or you say, wow, there's a real man. You're saying he's in some way a superior man, a more perfect man than other men. Or you watch Tom Brady playing quarterback. You say, there's a real quarterback. You're saying he's in some sense superior to the other quarterbacks. So we often use that word real to mean is in some sense more perfect. So the real is a more perfect. And the world of perfections is the world of forms. We already went over that, how the perfections exist up here. They're the universals. And so the world of forms is more real. Once again, let's look at another way. We say that the original is more real than the imitations. Now, before that one makes sense, Plato views the particulars here as somehow being shadows of the chair up here, somehow being imitations of chairness. And so, well, let's go to our earlier argument. You have to have knowledge of the universal before you can have knowledge of the particulars. So the universal has to exist before the particulars. That's a better way to say it. The universal has to exist before the particulars. Now, the original is more real than the imitations, the things that come after. Imagine I got some great artist to do a perfect, close to perfect, imitation of the Mona Lisa. Almost no one would pay for it. People wouldn't pay 1/10 for that, what they pay for the actual Mona Lisa. They say, no, that's not the real thing. I want the real thing. That's just an imitation. Even if they got all the same paint in all the same places. They don't care. They want the real one. So the original is more real than its imitations. Whichever one came first is in some sense more real than the thing imitating it. And the particulars are just imitations of a form. And so once again, the world of forms is more real than this world. And so, true reality is the world of forms. Good? And so how does this world exist in relation to the world of forms? And now we're going to get into his Timaeus. So his Timaeus, it's one of his more Pythagorean doctrines. And it was one of his most famous works through the majority of history. For 1,000 years, roughly, in Western civilization, it was the only one of Plato's works that was known. All the other ones had been lost to time and then were rediscovered. And so, it had a massive effect, and so it's good that we understand this Timaeus because we see how the doctrine of the Timaeus seeps into thought. Alright, so what is the nature of this world then, if it's not the real reality? If the real reality is the world of forms, what's the nature of this world that we're experiencing all the time, and how's it related to reality? Plato says it is a reflection or projection of true reality. It both is, and kind of is not. Both kind of is real and kind of is not real. Now, how does this world exist? Here's just an analogy. Imagine that you have me standing at the center of the room with a bunch of light sources spinning around me, casting a bunch of shadows all over the wall. Now, as the light sources are spinning, those shadows look like they're moving. Furthermore, I have many shadows. Some of the shadows are going to be better representations of me. Other shadows are going to be worse representations of me. But there's going to be many shadows. Those many shadows are like the many objects in our universe, which are somehow shadows of the forms that exist up here. To the extent that it's a better shadow of that actual object is to the extent that it's more superior. A chair that's a better shadow of chairness is superior to a chair that's a worse shadow of chairness. And I just wanted to put this picture here to show you how the same object can easily cast two drastically different types of shadows. Now, this image says this is true, this is true, this is true. That's not how Plato would say it. Plato would say this is opinion, this is true. So you see the shadows of reality, and you form opinions based off of those shadows of reality that you see. But you don't ever see the truth directly. You can only see the truth with the mind's eye. Instead, you experience all these shadows. And so you experience all these shadows of chairness, and from those shadows, you're reminded of, oh yes, chair. I recall it now from seeing its shadows, from seeing its reflections in this world. Again, just an analogy. The shadows are imperfect representations, while some may be better than others. And so, as the light source is going around, it can cast a good shadow of me. Oh yes, that's Donnie. Worse shadows of me, harder to tell. If I show you a really fine chair, you say, oh yes, that's a chair. If I show you a stump in the ground, it doesn't look so much like a chair anymore. So the better the shadow is, the better imitation of chairness it is, the more it represents reality. And just say it, we're going to get a little bit of a foundation now for some of his ethics. Our job as human beings is to try to be perfect imitations of manness. We're individual men. Our job is to be perfect imitations of manness. And so you become a better imitation of manness by becoming a more excellent man. The same way that a chair becomes a better reflection of chairness by being a more excellent chair, you become a better imitation of manness by being a more excellent man. And what are the excellences of man? Wisdom, courage, temperance, justice. So he's going to set up his ethics with this similar foundation. So just give you a taste for how that's going to tie in down the road. So there is a perfect, immovable, non-physical reality projecting itself outwards. Now it's not really projecting out. It exists somewhere else and is somehow projecting into our universe. So that real reality is projecting itself outward to create the appearance of the imperfect, changing physical world that we see around us. If I'm standing there unmoving and all those light sources are spinning around me, even if I'm standing perfectly still, it looks like my shadows are moving, and it looks like I have multiple shadows, even though I'm just one thing. That was the analogy. Similarly, that's what's going on here. The form of chairness has many projections in our universe, which we call chairs. If one chair is superior to another chair, it is a superior projection of chairness. That's how we rate one chair as being better than another. It's in reference to chairness. That's how we rate chairs. And that's how we can say one's better and one's worse. Reality, the world of forms, projects itself into the void, nothingness, and since the void is 3D, the projections create 3D reflections. We are 3D reflections of manness. So it's a projection, but it's a projection into like a 3D medium. And since it's a projection into a three-dimensional medium, it creates three-dimensional objects. Instead of a two-dimensional shadow, you're a three-dimensional shadow, a physical thing somehow. So the projections create 3D reflections, physical objects, that both are and are not. You're kind of real because you're a projection of something that's real, But you're kind of not real because you're a projection into the void, nothingness. If we got rid of the void, we would have also gotten rid of that chair. So that chair exists as a physical object in the void, in nothingness, because a void is 3D. So reality projects itself into the void, creating that physical object, the chair. And so that physical object, the chair, kind of is and kind of isn't. It has some reality, but it also has some non-reality, some void, some nothingness, coming together in one. So since in this world we have non-reality and reality coming together, then we both kind of are and are not. Real reality, the world of forms. And that's why we can have change and contradictions in this world. Okay. So the projections create 3D reflections, physical objects that both are and are not. Since a thing's both being and not being what it is and isn't is a sufficient condition for change, change is now allowed to occur in our world. So now it's okay that we have change, and it all makes sense. Because you're a projection of reality into 3D nothingness. That's why you have change. Okay. So now, how did the world come into existence? How did this all start? Both the world of forms and the void are eternal. There was no start to the world of forms, and there was no start to the void. They always and forever existed. However, there's a myth of the demiurge. Demiurge can roughly be translated as the craftsman. Now, when he puts forward this myth, it's meant to be taken seriously, but not literally. Okay, so the myth of the demiurge, you got the craftsman. The demiurge, seeing this universe in an unorganized state and with an eye on the world of forms, gave order to this universe by shaping matter into imitations of the form. This initial ordering introduced all the nature and law into our universe. Now, to help make some of this make sense, you need to have a better understanding of how objects exist in this world of forms. In this world of forms, you have the object that represents triangularity. There it is. You have the object that somehow represents 180 degrees. There it is. Since every triangle has 180 degrees, in the world of forms, there is some connection between those objects that actually exists. And so when you are applying logic in this world, when you're reasoning in this world, when you see something in this world, when you make a connection in your mind in this world, you're really seeing a connection that actually exists in the world of forms. And so all the objects in the world of forms, all these universals, actually have all this physical structure relating them to each other. And coming to learn is actually seeing this structure. And so the demiurge, when he comes along, this demiurge, basically kind of like a god, but it's a god that just kind of puts the universe into order and then he's kind of done with it. So he's just the one initially starting things off. So he has his mind to the world of forms. And he intentionally tries to form things in our universe to imitate this world of forms. And so now, every single time in this world that you go and you make some imitation of this triangularity, it also seems to imitate having that 180 degrees when you add up its angle sum. Because that was actual structure that existed from the beginning. And so all these things that seem to work, how logic always seems to work in our universe, is because the demiurge put a lot of effort into making sure that it did. So he initially orders everything so it follows the pattern laid out by the world of forms. And so that's why it seems like reasoning about truth can often have useful applications in this world. Because this demiurge was kind enough to put things in order this way. So the demiurge gives us initial spinning off that basically introduces all the natural laws of the universe and gets things going all nice and orderly the way we know and love. And that's why it isn't some chaotic universe where you do one triangle and at one instant has 180 degrees and the next instant is 70 degrees. It stays at that 180 degree sum. So that was the demiurge. Now, the argument for the demiurge is one of the earliest arguments from design that there is. Since this universe is so well designed, there must have been some designer who came along and designed the universe. So that's his argument for the demiurge. The initial craftsman, the initial designer who put things in order and then went on his merry way. And then each of these objects up here are actual, they're the good objects. Remember, how do you be a good human? You imitate that humanity form the best that you can. you be as perfect an imitation of it as you can. How do you be a good chair? You imitate chairness to the best of your ability. How do you be a good triangle? You imitate triangle. This is a bad triangle. That does not imitate triangularity very well. This is a much superior triangle. It does a better job imitating triangularity. That's how we talk about things being better or worse. And it's good to be more like your form. And so the good is being like your form. That's how you be good as an individual thing. Whether you're going to be a good piece of chalk, a good triangle, or a good human. All the same. What about evil in the universe? So the forms are good. And so something is good to the extent that it mirrors its form. Evil, on the other hand, Plato doesn't view as a physical thing. Evil is just lacking that form, being a bad imitation. So it's not that evil is a physical thing. It's not that evil is something. It's that there's good and then there's less good, the lack of the good. And the analogy he gives is like light versus dark. Dark is just the absence of light. To say in more modern times, there's photons and then there's not photons. We don't have darkness tons. There's just light or there's no light. So light exists. There's no such thing as no light. That's not a physical thing. There's just light and absence of light. So there's just good and absence of the good. So in this sense, there isn't evil in the universe.
The demiurge, I was curious if he had religious views throughout his life. He followed.
If Plato did or the demiurge?
Plato.
Oh, okay. Sorry.
I realized how I said that.
Yeah. So Plato, he seems to have a hint of Pythagoreanism in there, and he seems to have a hint of the Orthic religion in there. He's a religious man. What I would say that religion is, I don't know what to nail down to.
So we don't really know what his religion was.
We'll get an idea of it here in a second. His religion is basically the worship of the good.
The forms.
We're going to get to the form of the good. And what ends up happening, so trying to jump the gun here, and we'll be okay if we say it a few more times. Ultimately, we're going to say all these things are logically connected to the good, and we'll talk about its place in the chain later. But all these things ultimately in some way come back to the good, maybe through some chain or directly, but they all come back to the good. And it is somehow the cause for everything. And so what Neoplatonism is going to do is they're basically going to erase one of those O's and mix it with Christianity. They're going to say that God is the cause of everything, in the sense that Plato said the good is the cause of everything. But we'll get to more of that here in a second. But that's what the Neoplatonists do. Anyways, so we talked about evil. Okay. So the world of forms isn't a random collection of universals. All the forms are logically connected to each other in one integrated system. So I already tried to give you an idea of that. I can't have a universal over here all by itself. Everything is logically connected to the entire web. All universals are somehow logically connected to other universals. I know that all men are mortal. So whatever the manness universal is and the mortality universal is, they must somehow be connected. Any logical connections between universals that you have in your mind, you're actually developing structure that actually exists in reality. All learning is discovering the structure, or reminding yourself of the structure that you already experienced, is how Plato would say it. But anytime you're learning about structure that actually exists. Those logical connections actually exist. The 2 is related to the doubling and the 4 all together somehow. Some logical structure, some connection. So the world of forms is not a random collection of universals. All the forms are logically connected to each other with actual structure that exists. All natural laws and mathematical theorems are expressions of how these forms are related to each other. When we say all men are mortal, we are expressing a relation between the manness and the mortality universals. When we say that the sum of the angles of a triangle are 180 degrees, we are expressing relationships between triangularity and 180 degrees that actually exist in the world of forms. All knowledge is about the forms and how they are related to each other. actual structure. The goal of knowledge is to understand the overall structure of the world of forms. And you can kind of see this already when we talk about geometry. When we talk about geometry, for example, we start out with our 5 postulates. And we say these 2 postulates together, they imply this new thing. This postulate and this postulate together, they imply this thing. When you take that theorem and this postulate together, they imply this thing. And so developing all these logical connections, that's the exact same thing as developing the structure, or discovering the structure that exists in the world of forms. And so there's a whole part of this web up here that we call Euclidean geometry. That actually exists, always and forever, never changing. And that's why all the theorems of geometry are always true. All knowledge is about reality. Those things always exist and never change. And so that knowledge always works. So, where I said that. All knowledge is about the forms and how they are related to each other. The goal of knowledge is to understand the overall structure of the world of forms. If you could know this entire structure, you would know everything. Note that every field of knowledge starts with basic premises. For example, if you're doing Euclidean geometry, you start with those 5 postulates. If we were developing Newtonian mechanics, we would start with Newton's 3 laws. If we're doing Newtonian mechanics with Newton's law of gravity, introduce that as another law. Whatever your field is, dictates the starting points that you use as your basic assumptions to start reasoning from. So note that every field of knowledge starts with basic premises, basic assumptions, basic axioms, postulates, whatever you call them. The field then works to deduce the logical implication of the given set of premises. Doesn't matter if we're talking about mathematics, physics, ethics, whatever it is. These basic premises assume some relationships between the forms, and then we work to determine what other structure must exist in the world of forms. So we assume some basic things to get started, and then based off of those basic assumptions, start working from there. One of the basic things we assume is that on every line, there's at least 2 points. It's a basic assumption. We never derive that in Euclidean geometry. Unless we can validate these basic premises, Plato says, all our knowledge remains hypothetical at best. Because all we can ever say, all we know is that if our premises are true, then our conclusion must be true. We never know if our premises are actually true, and so we never know if our conclusions are actually true. We only know if the premises are true, then the conclusion is true. It's just hypothetical knowledge. Plato wants knowledge. We need some foundation, some self-intelligible form from which we can derive all our axioms or all our postulates, and thereby validate all our knowledge and achieve unity in all our knowledge. Mathematics, physics, ethics, we can tie them all together into one system, if we can do this. Once again, notice what we're doing. We're looking for the one in the many. Same thing that Thales was doing. What is the nature of the one supreme form from which all other forms can ultimately be derived? Whatever it is, it needs to be the explanation of everything. If I'm going to say that there's some form that we can start with, and from that form we can derive all Newton's postulates, and we can derive all the foundations of geometry, and we can derive all the foundations of a system of ethics, all from one form, whatever that form is, it has to be an explanation of everything. I'm saying from that form we can derive everything. So what is that form that we can derive everything from? Now note, Plato is a universal teleologist, one who believes that the entire universe serves some purpose. When the demiurge came along and he put everything into motion, it was for some purpose. Otherwise, why would the demiurge have ever done it? As opposed to being a mechanist, viewing you as just chemicals in motion. Plato says that the reason that you get up and get a drink of water is because you were thirsty. There was a purpose in mind. The atomists say, no, you were just jiggling in such a way that you couldn't help but go walk that way, grab that cup of water, hold it up to your mouth, gulp a few times, set it down, and continue jiggling on your way. No choice about it. So not only does Plato think that there's purpose in you, he thinks that there's purpose for the entire universe. So Plato is a universal teleologist. One who believes the entire universe serves some purpose. It was put into motion for some purpose. It came into existence for some purpose. As opposed to a mechanist. The atomist, mechanist, can only describe how things happen. They can never tell you why things happen. This is why Socrates early on got discouraged from him. He wanted to know, why am I standing right here in a war, right at the front lines, about to risk my life? The atomist would say, well, because you contracted your leg in such a way that it pushed you forward, And that's all they could tell you. They can't tell him why he was here. Why should I do this? Ought I to stay here? Ought I to risk my life? So those were much bigger questions. So whatever this thing is, it needs to give us that why. It needs to be towards some purpose. So if we want to know why, an actual explanation of everything, and not just how, a description of everything, then it must be in terms of some purpose. Since every action aims at some good, then the ultimate form must be the form of the good. So he thinks at the bottom of this whole framework, you might have over here your postulates for geometry, over here your postulates for Newtonian mechanics, over here your postulates for whatever ethics. And maybe there's some middle steps in between that you had to take, but ultimately if you started with the good, you could deduce all these things somehow, some way. And they could all somehow be deduced from the good. So since every action aims at some good, then the ultimate form must be the form of the good. That's what everything aims at. Anytime you attempt to do something, any action you attempt to take, is to attempt to accomplish some good. How you see it, at least. So, now what are the functions of the good? The good is the purpose of all of existence, and so is the source of all of existence. Everything came into existence for the sake of the good, to accomplish some good thing. There was some purpose to it all. And so it's the source of everything that actually exists. Nothing happens void of purpose. It was all put in motion for a reason. Since the good is also the fundamental axiom, it is the fundamental source of knowledge. It's what makes everything understandable. So since the good is our foundation here, the good is the reason we can know everything. Similarly, since the good is ultimately every action is targeted at some good, every purpose is targeted at some good, the good is also the reason that everything happens. So the reason everything is happening in this universe is for the good. The reason we can know anything is because it all comes back to the good. So it's both the source of knowledge and existence. Now, Plato gives a little bit of an analogy to help us understand this. Plato relates the form of the good to the sun. The sun both enables existence on earth as well as knowledge of the earth. So the sun, ultimately your source of light, enables you to experience the earth around you and come to understand the earth. So it's a source for you being able to come and understand the earth. Just an analogy. And then secondly, it's the source for everything that actually happens on the earth. Right? All plant life ultimately comes from the sun being there. You could never exist if you couldn't have eaten that antelope, which could eat the grass, which grew in the sunlight. Get rid of the sun, you get rid of all of us. So that's his analogy. The sun is both the thing that makes what happens on this earth actually happen on this earth, and furthermore, the sun is the thing that enables us to know about the things that happen on this earth. Similarly, the good is what causes everything in the universe to happen, and it's the reason that we can know about everything in the universe. It's our source of knowledge and the source of everything that happens. Both those things, the form of the good. Okay, so sounds like a wonderful form. I want to learn about this form. Teach me about the form, Plato. What exactly then is the good? At the very least, Plato thought that it couldn't be explained in writing. At the very least, he thought the only way to come and understand this form is through a dialectic method. And I can't just write it down on paper. I have to come with you, and we have to sit here and have a dialogue back and forth between you and me and a bunch of people. And we have to sit there and cross-examine your positions, and help you develop your intuition, until finally you experience it, and you have that intuition for the form of the good. And that's a unique process for every human being, and you have to work with them. And how do you know how does a person, you say, Plato, I want to know, did I have that intuition? Did I finally understand the form of the good? He says, when you have the experience and you get that intuition, you can't miss it. It's like we're a mile from the Grand Canyon, and you say, how much further to the Grand Canyon? Or you say, is this a Grand Canyon looking at a little ditch to me? And I say, no, keep walking. You can't miss it. You'll know it when you see it. When you see the Grand Canyon, you'll know this must have been what they were all talking about. It wasn't just this little pass. So when you have the experience, it will be obvious to you. And you'll finally have that intuition for what the good is. Notice that we can't construct some argument to it, because it's the foundation from which we make all argument. So the only way to get at the good is through this dialectic method of cross-examination, until your intuition finally experiences, oh, that's the good. That's what it is. So thought it couldn't be explained in writing. He possibly thought it was ineffable, even impossible to explain, and that it requires some sort of achieved intuition, such that once attained is self-intelligible. Once you have the intuition, you know you've had it. The way it's often explained is, to those that know, no explanation is necessary. To those that don't, no explanation is possible. You either get it or you don't. Until you don't get it, there's no way I can tell you what it is. We just have to keep going through that dialectic method until your intuition just finally grasps, oh yes, the form of the good. And once you get that form of the good, you can start deducing everything. So we thought. So, summarizing up his metaphysics here. There are two worlds. The world of the imperfect, physical, changing particulars, and then the world of the perfect, non-physical, static universals. This world and the world of forms. The world of forms is projected into the void, creating this physical world. So we're merely a projection of the world of forms. The good is the fundamental form, the reason for everything, and the source of our ability to comprehend anything. It's both the reason for existence, it's the why behind everything. Furthermore, it's the thing down here at the bottom of the structure. So it's also the source of our ability to comprehend anything. It all was somehow entailed logically by the good. And then, note how closely related the good and the true are. What's true? It's everything entailed by the good. That's what the true is. And so you can already see the relationship between the good and the true. We'll tie the beautiful into this eventually as well. But hopefully you can now see the argument for the objective and absolute good and true, at least so far. Okay. And that finishes his metaphysics. So I think we'll end it there and start with his epistemology next week. We won't be able to get very far into it. Any just questions?
Did he think that the universe of the particulars projected onto any other kind of way? So there was a universe that was a projection from us?
I have no idea if he would have thought that. There's nowhere that he makes that explicit that I'm aware of.
Is that an impossibility? Is it possible?
It would be weird because now you're particularizing particulars.
Right.
And so now you're saying there's a bunch of particular instances of Donnie, and Donnie's now somehow universal. And then if I am somehow universal, then I must somehow be knowable, and so I must somehow exist in the world of forms. But I don't, I exist here.
Okay.
But I'm not sure. I would guess no.
Yeah, right.
I've probably read 80% of his works.
This kind of reminds me of the world of the forms, a lot like classes in object-oriented programming. So.
That's exactly what it's like.
Yeah.
The world of forms, you can already see object-oriented programming in its foundations.
Yeah.
It's so cool.
Your classes, your abstractions, those are your universals, and then you have a bunch of different instances.
I don't even think about that.
And so you can already see how, even without instances existing, you can start designing abstractions. Start designing classes without any instances to abstract from. But yeah, a lot of programming concepts in here. I was afraid of that, using that word, an instance of, over and over again. But I think it works. Anything else? Cool, we'll end a little bit early and see you guys next week.
Thank you.
Very welcome.